Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Roy, a Global Leaders podcast vlog series. It's a forum in which we interact with global leaders and experts in their own right and try and dissect very compelling themes and matters and brings out perspectives and insights that truly matter for the audience at large. So in doing so, I have the absolute privilege of welcoming to the show today Raman Srinivasan. Raman is one of the finest brains in finance and strategy in the region. I had the privilege of knowing him for a while. Apart from that, he's also a very keen market commentator. He's a passionate economist by heart. And of course, he has a very strong views about the market in general, the stock market and business at large. Thank you, Raman. Thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Roy. It's always a pleasure. I firmly believe that in conversation with Roy, I've been following your podcasts, and I really believe that it's enlightening, it's thought-provoking, and there's never a dull moment. So, I'm absolutely delighted to be in this conversation with you, provoking some thoughts, sharing some knowledge. Yeah, so it's good.
Wonderful, Raman. Thank you so much. Kind as always. So, just let's go back a bit in terms of our good old friend, John Maynard Keynes. And he had mentioned once that, it's better to be roughly right than to be precisely wrong. And he went further in terms of saying that capitalism is the outstanding belief that the wicked people can do very wicked things for the goodness of the population at large. So let that sink for a while we get on to the topic at day to day. We've looked at tariff wars, trade wars, and this phenomena for a while now. This has been thrust upon us since the beginning of this year. But it's something that is not new. It's been there in the 18th century, 19th century, and even as of now, right? So if you go back to the British-Chinese Opium War, down to Hawley and the Scott Act of 1930, and then to the Trump era in 2018 and now. So it's not something that has been a novelty in any sense of the word, right? So let's try and dissect this phenomena of tariff wars, economic ransom or economic warfare. So in two perspectives. One is on the macro impact side and the micro variable side. And in doing so, let's also probably delve into the larger forces at play, be it your economy, be it your geopolitics, and the existential need, because as the new world order gravitates or tries to find its own feet, moving away from the colonial hangover and probably the whims and fancies of a select few. So I would like to have your initial thoughts in terms of what is this animal in the room called tariff and tariff wars.
Brilliant. Now, that was one of the longest questions that have ever been put to me, very thought-provoking, and I think it brings out a lot of perspectives and a lot of insights as well into this discussion. So if we were to start with John Maynard Keynes, who I consider to be probably the only economist who gets it right every time. Now, I know that there'll be some monetarists baying for blood when I say that,
right.
But John Maynard Keynes generally gets it right. But by the way, it is said that, was it Keynes or generally that, in the long run, we're all dead. So therefore, at the same time, whilst you have classical economists, you also need to deal with the present. Now, specifically about tariffs, since your question predominantly revolves around tariffs, so therefore, is it new? No, it's not new. As you yourself have alluded to, there are precedents in the past.
Yeah.
And in the very recent past as well. We've had the similar kind of upheavals during the Ronald Reagan regime. Yeah. So we had the Plaza Accord of the late 1980s. So therefore, it's not new. Does it disturb the flow of, let's say, economic prosperity in the longer term? No, it didn't. If the Plaza Accord is a precedent, it had an impact for a couple of years, and eventually we went to other institutionalized arrangements for managing the global economy.
Yeah.
What is at center stage here is not only tariffs, but what are the perceptions around tariffs, and as you correctly said, the weaponization of tariffs. So I think the current phase which we are passing through is not entirely about tariffs. It is about the US saying that we are the largest, the grandest debtor to the entire world. And one of the reasons that we are so is because the dollar has been supremely strong, and we need to get our house in order. So therefore, That is what is prompting the current. It's been aggressive ever since the new Trump administration took over, but tariffs is one part of it. The other part is the other bit of macroeconomics, the US being indebted, the dollar being strong. So therefore, all these issues come into play. From that perspective, I think tariffs is a passing phase. And Roy, we've been kind of in connect on various issues over the past years. We generally see that the pendulum swings to the left or to the right, depending upon how you wish to see it, and eventually it achieves around a center. So what we've seen since Liberation Day, as Trump called it, April the 2nd, is gravitation towards more sensible negotiations. So therefore, we've had the UK and the US negotiating a deal. On the sidelines, we've had India and the UK negotiating a deal. And guess what? China and the US are now finally talking. So this is about the US style, or let's say Trump's style of inviting the global community to the negotiation table. Is it the best way of sending out an invitation? Probably not. Are there reasons that he's doing so? Probably there are, yes. And it has to do with geopolitics as well as macroeconomic strategies. So there are several things which are involved here.
Very well articulated, Raman. And I was, in fact, about to jump onto that next cue that you already kind of mentioned. Tariff, has come in different forms, interestingly, right on from bananas to corns to chickens to lumber to land to steel, and then right now in trade wars, right? And what started off as a tariff war, just as a negotiation ploy or as a bargaining tool, is meandering into different aspects of how diplomacy should work. Coercion should probably take shape. And so I can't help but wonder about the intent and the purpose and the ramifications of the tariff phenomena going forward. What does it augur, A, for the developed world, B, for the developing world, and 3, for the third world countries? And how do you see that precedent playing out in different forms beyond the very invincible, innocent tariff wars coinage as we see it?
That again is a great question. So, yes, like it or not, the world is categorized into, let's say, the developed, developing, or let's say the aspirational as well. The world's always been like that. It's been a world of haves and have-nots. Yeah. And in general, the haves have had it, no pun intended, and the have-nots have been left out. Are these tariffs going to result in an outcome that is any different? Probably not. These tariffs are anchored on the US finally realizing that they've been a marketplace for the entire world, and one has to accept that their tariffs, if we look at pre-Liberation Day, or let's say a couple of years before that, were one of the lowest in the world. So therefore, this is about, it's a perspective of one particular nation which is trying to realign the ways in which it wants to do business with the rest of the world. As to its impact, let's say if we talk about impact, let's say we put into 3 subsets, haves and haves. So if you see the US and the UK, they've already kissed and made up. The US and the EU eventually will. And then if we talk about developing, for instance, the US and Brazil or the US and India, eventually, regardless of whether it is Brazil, India, these countries will also have to tango with the US, because at the end of the day, the purchasing power is still with the US. Now, you've raised a very excellent point, and I think this doesn't get enough coverage in wider mainstream media. What happens to Africa? What happens to the poorer countries of Latin America? Does anyone give anything? Nothing is going to change. For them, life is going to get much harder, especially African countries that rely on commodity exports. Commodity prices have tumbled. Their budgets have been drastically rearranged. Their ability to feed their populations, which itself was a challenge. Some of them were looking to just grow out and see the horizon. Those hopes are set back by a good 6, 9, 12 months. So therefore, it's not doing good for anyone. except, I guess, in this case, the US perceives, and that also is a hypothesis.
Yeah.
Whether it will actually achieve the objectives or not, only time can tell. There are countries in Africa which still find it challenging to feed their populations. The tariffs are not going to do them any good. In fact, it's going to get worse in the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months. Hopefully, by the time that trade deals are reached by the US with the main countries with whom they have grievances, the rest of the world will continue to suffer. The US itself will suffer. However, the hypothesis that the US is going on is multi-pronged in terms of they're decidedly, if I may use the term, a bit internal at this point of time. They're focusing on themselves, and that's a paradigm shift itself. So you typically had the US saying that, we care about the world, we want to intervene everywhere, and, we are the gatekeepers for the world. A lot of things have changed. So therefore, it's a kind of more internalized, it's a more reflection on themselves, and the perception is that this hypothesis will deliver a lot of good to the American economy. So it is a kind of self-centered perspective for the US.
Correct. Fair. I mean, if I have to just pause for a moment and then probably reflect back in terms of what's been the trigger. The trigger has come in from the US. And probably if I have to put in, let's say, a devil's advocate hat really for a moment and try and see why did the US prod the line that it did. And I think that there are some merits to that as well, because obviously they had been the wrong side of the pricing. I mean, they were able to operate at, let's say, a single-digit pricing for the world at large, but they were being tariffed in not many ways that was favorable to them so far. So, yeah. It is in the national interest, it is in their interest that they would have acted on it. But having said that, if you look at the administration's policies, really, it is anchored in 3 pillars. First of all, they would like to reduce the annual fiscal deficit, because obviously they import more than they export. Yes. B, they would love to really, like and love is a different word, but they would like to improve that domestic manufacturing strength. And thirdly is they would like to bring in a sense of parity, if not, probably a ascendancy in terms of how they can drive the so-called pricing or the tariffs. Now, while the parity in terms of the pricing probably can be contained, can be achieved, because yes, I mean, there's no denying the fact that the US continues to be the largest consumer in the world. But having said that, it can also go into probably reducing the fiscal deficit in a large way, because once the pricing is achieved, obviously they will have things where they should be able to import, or let's say export goods outside at favorable terms. But the domestic manufacturing, I think that is more said than done, because it will take a lot of time for you to get in those factories in place. And the critical aspect in there is how do you get in the key aspect of labor. So far, the labor availability, the pricing of labor, so on and so forth, was coming in from a certain quarter, right? So how do you address that fact that whilst it is a good intent, the ways and means might not be as much, but having said that, will it really be counterproductive to what the US is trying to do? Because as we speak now, it might just be a blip in the so-called radar that the US currency is kind of losing its value, euro is climbing. So how do you see that? Because a lot of the currencies in the world are pegged against the US dollar. Will there be a alternate pegging, probably from BRICS or Euro and so on and so forth? Answer is no. But having said that, do you see that as a very temporary interim phase, or probably there will be some kind of correction going forward?
Okay, yeah. So several key pointers in this question. So therefore, first let's address the hypothesis itself. So therefore, you're correct. What will tariffs do? Tariffs will primarily make it more expensive for Americans to consume, let's say, foreign goods and services, and it'll make it cheaper for foreign countries to consume American goods and services. So that's one aspect. The second is, and they're not done there. So when the negotiations do take place, the United States would like countries across the world to sell the dollar. So therefore, the United States decidedly wants a weaker dollar. And it's no coincidence, Roy, that we've had some of the trading partners' currencies with the US actually appreciating and the dollar actually dropping. So that's number two.
Correct.
The third prong is, we also have to consider that a lot of these countries, which you correctly said are pegged to the dollar, they hold almost their at least 80% or more of their currency reserves in the dollar itself or in treasuries.
Correct.
So therefore, there's going to be, if the US, hypothetically wants to use the hypothesis, there would have to be a sell-off in treasuries as well. So therefore, the sell-off in treasuries obviously means an yield spike. But here is where I say that the hypothesis still works because they're looking to avoid the yield spike by swapping those for 50-year bonds or century bonds, thereby managing the yield spike as well.
Yeah.
And the fourth prong in all of this is the geopolitical clout which the US has in terms of providing security to the rest of the world. So therefore, these are the four prongs. But having said that, if we specifically talk about, what's it going to do to the countries that are pegged to the dollar, I think these countries, they really need to examine where they stand as in terms of central banking and do they wish to take control of their units. I think it's high time that they need to do that because the US is now decidedly looking to weaken its own currency because it's decided that, enough is enough. They don't want to consume as much. Before we go to the pegging, we'll address the point about manufacturing. Is it possible even for a country to establish grand manufacturing capabilities over a period of, for example, even if Mr. Trump gets a second term, so let's say 7.5 years, no, it's not going to happen. It's never happened.
Far-fetched.
It's never going to happen. It takes decades to industrialize. So therefore, the US themselves are responsible because they de-industrialized. So therefore, we had Detroit. What is left of Detroit now? It's a ghost town. Where is the US moved towards? The US is moved towards Wall Street, which is making money by greed. And yes, they do have large presence in technology. But to create jobs on a sustainable basis, you really need to focus on manufacturing, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. So now that brings us to, let's say, the currency pegs. I think that's a very, very, very interesting question because as we are sat, some of the richest countries in the world, especially in the GCC, for instance, are pegged to the dollar. And imagine that they hold vast amounts of their reserves in dollars and treasuries. And the US is looking for a weaker dollar. So imagine that next year, this time, the dollar is dropped by, let's say, 10%. By the way, it already did. So if you looked at the DXY, the dollar index from about 108.5 at the beginning of this year, it went down to 99 levels. It breached 99 and went to 98.6 on the 21st of April. They have to consider the impact that this would have on not only trade, but also on their wealth. So I think it's a time to get into a huddle and think about the way that they want to grow, the way that they want to do central banking, and the way that they want to take initiative into their own hands for their fiscal and monetary policies. I firmly believe that the days of being a shadow to the Fed and mimicking or replicating the actions of the Fed and prospering, I think there's a decoupling there, and I think a lot of serious thought has to go there, Roy.
Interesting thoughts, Raman. And probably just coming closer to how the market sentiment is, JP Morgan Chase came very close to raising the probability of recession from 16% to 60% in 2025. And they said there will be a degrowth in terms of GDP, falling down by 1 to 2 or 3%. And they said it's attributed to probably, a decrease in investment, rising prices, unemployment, and probably the uncertainty around the tariff wars. So how do you see it? I mean, would you still be a hawk and say, well, you know what, we are close to having 2 consecutive quarters of degrowth? Would we officially be calling this end of June probably as a recession, or probably would that be too far-fetched or too adventurous?
Will the US go into recession? The likelihood is that probably it will. But the broader, let's say, architecture which you're alluding to and which I can clearly see is the US even bothered about a fleeting recession? That is the question that a lot of market mania are not asking because in some ways it's a rhetorical question as well. So when the Plaza Accord happened, the US did briefly suffer. And if we go back to, for example, the transition from, I think it was the transition from Kennedy to Carter, we had hyperinflation in the US in the late 70s and 80s, and we had Paul Volcker, who raised interest rates in the US, can you believe it, to beyond 21% and pushed the country into recession. And he said from day one that I am going to cause pain and I have the mandate to cause pain. What we also have to bring into context, and that's why in conversation with Roy is always thought-provoking, is that what is the governance underneath and what is the mandate that the administration holds?
Right.
Let's not forget that the United States of America is the most powerful, democratically governed nation in the world. They are not only democratically governed at a political level, they also have the institutions to back it up.
Yeah.
Look at the pressures on the Fed to lower the rates. ECB has done that almost 3-4 weeks ago. The UK did that a few days ago. Fed is holding steady. So that conveys a sense of independence that exists within the US. So the US have those institutions. And we also need to talk about the mandate. And whilst recession might occur, I personally don't think they give a damn. Even if recession occurs, let it occur as long as they achieve the longer term objective. So it's about balancing short term pain with a longer term gain. And as long as I always come back to saying that if the hypothesis holds, and we may never know whether it actually holds or not, hypothesis. So let's say that physicists do it all the time. So they say, we are theoretical physicists. Don't talk to us about laboratory experiments. We're not interested in that because we'll get shown up. So if we divide economics into, the economics of hypothesis and the economics of actually studying what's happening,
right,
the two are slightly different. So as an economic hypothesis, if this is the US's perspective, recession is a price to be paid in the short term for a gain in the longer term, which is what? A weaker dollar, which is the reduction of the fiscal deficit, as you correctly said, which is eventually in the next probably 40, 50 years, setting up some manufacturing in the US. Yes, I think the hypothesis holds good.
Lovely. And would that also mean some very unique coinages like stagflation and deflation, recession, and so on and so forth? So do you see these things happening? Because when you look at stagflation, obviously the technical term goes into stagnation, right? Your high inflation, low employment, and so on and so forth. And probably if you take one step further, if there's decrease in consumption, I think that only kind of aggravates the problem. So where do you see us at this particular point in time in economic terms? Are we still in some kind of a curveball? Should we give it some name? U curve, V curve, and so on and so forth. How do you see it, mainly from an economist angle?
So let's assume for a moment that we say that the US goes into recession, let's say sometime in the next 3 months. Now, does that immediately mean that, there's panic and, people are withdrawing capital from the US and sending it overseas? The question is, where are they going to send it?
Correct.
The other thing which we need to talk about is that why is it that in a world where only 30-35% of the trade is in US dollars, why are 60-69% of the global forex reserves held in the dollar? So that itself conveys the extent of the mismatch. So I don't think that, the classical interpretations of the Phillips curve, which is the relationship between, unemployment and inflation, will that lead to a kind of stagflation kind of a situation? I don't think so. I think the administration probably seems to be moving faster. So from that perspective, probably not. Where are we in terms of shape? I would say that we probably are in... It's not going to be V-ish. It probably is going to be U-ish. And even if there is a recession, it's a price that they're willing to pay. And it's something which I personally think will be fleeting, because guess what? There's something about the world, and it's a fundamental truth, is that the world is chaotic. It's written into the laws of nature that the world is always tending towards chaos. It's never tending towards uniformity or cohesion. So when you bring that and when you put that into perspective, and when you churn up and charge up that particular environment, it may actually favor the US, and they may actually come out of it as in the form of, since you asked for a shape, probably you. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well articulated, Raman. See, it's a very volatile time, and volatility is the toll we pay to invest, as they say, right? So, from an economist point of view, what are those economic data points that will be required to make decisions through volatility? I could probably think of three. I could be wrong. You might want to correct me on that. Daily treasury statements. Probably what are those non-interest government funding or government spending really? Is it into healthcare, education, human services? What are those individual withholding of taxes that the corporates are doing, which in turn would lead to a job loss probably at that end of the spectrum? You would look at private sector data, how many job postings are happening, how much credit spending is happening, and so on and so forth, probably unemployment claims insurance, and so on and so forth. So from an economist point of view, what are those data points that we should be relying on at this point in time?
So therefore, what is volatility? Volatility assumes that there was a kind of a steady state or something which was more predictable, which has now become unpredictable. So there are two aspects to volatility. Things can get volatile towards a negative direction, but things can also get volatile towards a positive direction. So what is a measure of volatility? It's a good question. I mean, if you look at the US, for example, the VIX, which is the S&P futures, it's been crying out for some attention. So it reached all-time highs, post-COVID highs, I must say, around the 9th of April. But bear in mind that there itself is a mirror. So therefore, if post-Liberation Day and a week after that, the VIX did not surpass COVID volatility, that indicates that over a period of time and having come through COVID, although the two instances are very different, that was cooperative, this is competitive, the two are very different. The world itself has inculcated intuitively or through muscle memory how to deal with volatility. Now, in, let's say, markets which are not as sophisticated, how do you measure volatility? Any spike in prices of factors of production, any spike in wages, any spike in commodities. Spike could also mean, a trough. So any downward movement, any upward movement, any, as you said, sudden pullback of investment or any sudden rush of investments. We've always had volatility, Roy. I mean, in the sense that in some part of the world or other, there has been a distress event. The world, unfortunately, has always been balanced by, to say good and evil will take us into theology, and this is a podcast about economy. So if we stay from economy, the world has always been balanced by, as I say, economic distress and economic prosperity. So from that perspective, volatility is something that half of the world does not even care about. If you ask somebody, let's say Brazil or India, do you follow volatility or do you follow the VIX? They say, I have enough volatility to deal with here because, I'm having a hard time negotiating my prices. So volatility is about, it has different connotations, and we all see it in our daily lives. It's all about trying to reach a new equilibrium, and different, jurisdictions and countries see it in different ways.
Well said, Raman. Would it be fair to say that probably this particular phenomena or tariff wars that we see now is probably the symptom of a larger identity crisis among the superpowers, so to speak?
Brilliant. And I think that's the finest question that, I've not seen this question being put to anyone, even on Bloomberg. So it's a very deep question. It's a very thought-provoking question. So, is the ability to unleash economic warfare. So let's call a spade a spade. So let's say it's economic warfare. What does it convey? It conveys, first of all, that you have the economic prowess to unleash economic warfare. Secondly, if war, conventional warfare, is the pursuit of, diplomacy by other means, should economic warfare be any different? Are there any rules? I think you asked a wonderful question earlier, which I probably didn't respond to at that point of time. There are no rules. So there are no rules. What does it indicate? It indicates the alpha male. Have we as humans, now taking a step back, we'll go to Charles Darwin on the evolution of species. Have we evolved beyond our aspiration, as in generally, to be the alpha male? We haven't. So from that perspective, the US is flexing their muscle, China is flexing their own muscle. We've had tit, we've had tat, we've had tit for tat, and this keeps on going till, again, I say that the pendulum swings right or left. It keeps swinging. That's your volatility as well. And then eventually it reaches a new balance. Will the new balance be the old balance? Probably not.
Interesting.
Will they have rearranged and done something? Probably yes. So whenever there is a major geological event, let's take, for example, a tsunami or a volcano, it impacts the planet, scars it permanently. The sea level never drops back, it never recedes, it leaves itself at a new level. So I think it is a symptom. It is a symptom of having unguarded power. It is also, unfortunately, an indication of the total laissez-faire attitude by international governance institutions, such as, shall we say, UN? I probably call it un, because, it's un about everything.
Correct.
WTO?
Absolutely.
Probably. I mean, so therefore, it is a melee. It's a systemic melee. And in a world where everybody fends for himself or themselves, or the nations themselves at the end of the day, there are no rules. From that perspective, unfortunately, to give you the whole spectrum, it is manifestation of the primeval human aspiration to be the alpha male, which is ultimately cascaded right into a mandate. Even in a democracy, mandates do sometimes surprise. And here is, we still have to accede that at the end of the day, it's still better to have that kind of, let's say, even coercion, as you referred to, even those hard discussions with a nation which is democratically accountable, as opposed to one that has no accountabilities at all. So therefore, I hope I've been able to do justice to a very interesting question.
No, very interestingly answered as well. I mean, it is an evolving sense, really, and it comes in from different schools of thought. And one school of thought is also veering towards the reality that are we witnessing the slow death of globalization, or would you rather look at it as its rebirth or a reset in some form?
Brilliant. Okay. So, when the oil crisis happened, did we witness, for example, the death of the American way of life or the death of free flow of oil? No, we did not. Did it lead to technological disruptions and coming up with internal combustion engines that were far more efficient in using fuel? It did. And eventually, did the world outgrow it? Yes, the world outgrew it. And today we are, let's say, at oil prices of, if I say, not the WTI, the Brent. The Brent is, hovering around 63, 64. But in our time, Roy, we've seen Brent go upwards of 100, 120.
Correct.
So did the world think that, there is, things are falling apart, the wheels are coming off? Probably not. So from that perspective, I would say that, is this a kind of decoupling of an entire economic, a global economy? Is it going to lead to isolationist economies? Yes and no. And why should we not bring in China to the table for a discussion? Now, let's go back to the 1950s, 60s or 70s. If you had asked anybody, what was China, they would say that, it's a walled country. So therefore, did anybody see that the world was isolated because of that? No, not really. And then look at China now, they are the factory for the entire world. Absolutely. So from that perspective, if the US withdraws, Does it mean that China is not going to respond or safeguard their interests? No, I don't think so. I think if anything, history has taught us that they're going to be far more aggressive. Now, does that mean that if the big boys are slugging it out, the rest of the world is just going to watch on and see the Titanic sink? No, not really. So you will have some kind of nations which are thinking about a new world economic order coming together. Probably not BRICS, because BRICS is China-centric, China-heavy. Probably the European Union probably they have an opportunity. I think they really have the opportunity of a century or even 150 years to rise to the occasion and say that, we can take this forward. We can take this forward. So if the US goes into a mode of isolation for the next 20, 30 years, I don't think it's an issue which is going to fundamentally change the way that the world perceives economics, or that the way that you and I, we make a living, for example.
Wonderful, wonderful, and very interesting thoughts, Raman. So, where does one draw a line? Where does one draw a line in the sand to say that, fair enough, we have alphaness and spinelessness of certain, unbecoming of international bodies and institutions who ought to have done their work and which they haven't. So where do the nations look at their own sovereignty, look at their own foreign policy, their financial policy, and say, hey, we will subscribe, we will not get prescribed or proscribed, right? And that's where, I think the alternate fronts or the alternate forums, like you mentioned, probably EU-led or BRICS-led and so on and so forth, they have to come together, because it's not only about one particular big brother calling the shots. I mean, for the wrong reason or the right reason is a different debate. But it is also, in a sense, a part of a colonial hangover that most people have not been able to shake off, despite the elephant being stronger and the dragon being stronger. The Big Ben or, Mr. Michael always happens to have the hand, So how do you look at that? Because whilst I understand that it is good for the world order to have alphaness and probably which are democratically led, and democratic values again is a very different debate altogether in the context of present times. But how do you see that happening? Because the moment you lose sovereignty in that sense of the word on the economic front, when the laissez-faire you spoke about becomes just a lexicon in some trade market books, but it's not practiced in reality. So I believe we are slowly veering towards probably a scenario where you will be driven by coercion, you'll be driven by action, and the mighty will only become the mightier. And in all this conundrum, I think the entire debate about the haves and the have-nots, the developed and the developing in the third world, and so on and so forth, I think we'll have more extensions of the third world and the fourth world and the fifth world to come by. Your thoughts on that, Raman?
Yeah, I think in a new world order, if one does come about, will we be any further away from, let's say, polarization? So therefore, if, let's say, the world is roughly polarized into, let's say, democratic economics, or we will say, call it free market economics, and regulated economics or regulated economies, will we be any better off? No, I don't think so. As far as, it's an excellent question on economic sovereignty. A lot of times we talk about sovereignty as in terms of guarding one's own motherland and borders, and whilst that is noble and indeed should be done, how many countries in the world, if I talk specifically about Africa, how many countries truly have economic sovereignty? They don't. In fact, when countries go into implosion, what happens is they lose faith in their own currencies, and they opt for what? The US dollar. So like it or not, I don't see an alternative coming up to the US dollar. As I said, Europe has a great opportunity, but will the world be accepting of that is again something very doubtful. And again, to, I guess, settle into a more calmer environment to be able to receive that profound question from you and answer that, we really have to also allow time for certain deliberation. So therefore, is anyone really serious about thumping anyone else with 150% tariffs? No, not at all. It basically conveys an aggression. take it like a gorilla which is beating its chest. It's conveying a message that I'm here to dominate you. And regardless of, even if this tariff war peters over, why are we forgetting the next era of dominance? The next era of dominance is one where borders become irrelevant.
Yeah.
To some extent, even trade in the way that we perceive it becomes irrelevant. We are at the cusp of something which is scary, something which can think like humans, something which can act like humans, and even more dangerously, something which is being taught to replicate human biases and human emotions. And once artificial intelligence is unleashed, then we will have to measure the world's economic prosperity in very different terms. Today, we look at purchasing power parity, which was, I guess, a thing of the 80s and 90s, and maybe the 2000s. And then we talked about digital penetration. Today, a marker for economic prosperity, or let's say the likelihood of economic development, is digital penetration, mobile penetration. How many connections? Do you have 4G, 5G? What kind of speed? What kind of bandwidth? What kind of coverage? The future is a scary place. The future is where artificial intelligence will rule over human judgment to a larger extent. That artificial intelligence will in turn be controlled by a group full of humans. So therefore, future economic warfare could well be really, unleashed by artificial intelligence. So we probably will see, if this is V 4.0, the V 5.0 is going to be far more scary.
Correct.
And I don't think any of those countries which do not have economic sovereignty today, I don't think they're going to be better off, simply because the way that the world is perceiving and unleashing AI, again, seems to be heavily biased towards the same footprint, which is exactly orchestrating the kind of coercive activity that you have alluded to.
Ominous signs, Raman. My last question before we draw it to a close. What would you have to say to all the CEOs and the CFOs and all these strategic boards who are getting into a VC framework, the Series A funding, startup ecosystem, who'd like to grow further? So is it a time to probably optimize the bottom line further, keep a much more firmer check, wait and watch? Or would you rather say, okay, fair enough, I'm an incorrigible optimist, let's go to market strategy with a bang, let's optimize or let's say enhance the top line? What do you advocate to the CFOs at large, CEOs at large, and those founders who've got a lot of dreams and so on and so forth? Is it the time to really delve further, or should we just wait and watch and see how it unfolds the next couple of months, quarters? And how do you think that's going to impact the level of employment, the level of skills requirement, and the level of optimism in a region per se?
Right. So therefore, there are, I think, 2 or 3 parts to that question. So therefore, if we're looking at a business which is, let's say, already active and operating, and let's say that this business achieved a certain amount of funding and is looking to attract further funding, what should be the priority as of now? I would, and I am a vocal advocate. I've been saying this for, I think, even a couple of years, even before tariffs, that companies, especially here in the GCC, aren't doing enough about risk. When I say risk, the entire spectrum, the risk acknowledgement, the risk awareness, the risk mitigation. So every day, or at least every week, our boards and CEOs and the chief risk officers sitting together and exchanging views for even 10 minutes. Where are we as risks today? I don't think that's happening enough. In fact, I don't even think that a lot of large business groups have even evolved to the sophistication of having a risk function. I'm not talking about assurance. A lot of people think that, okay, when Raman talks about risk, he's talking about internal audit. No. Risk is something entirely different. Risk is something which sits right on top of the pyramid. And therefore, instead of looking at the CEO as a CEO in those kind of environments, startups, I would probably say that the CEO is also the CRO. He's the chief risk officer. He's also the chief conserving officer. So from that perspective, I think any business which is already in operation and looking to expand, I think conserve cash or reduce the cash burnout for the next couple of months. Because there is a moratorium that Trump has set, which is July 7th. It's not too far off. So hold on to your horses for now.
Wait and watch.
Wait and watch. And the VC, the VC ecosystem has always been murky. I'm a practitioner of valuation. I have been practicing valuations for more than a decade now. I haven't been able to understand VC valuations. I mean, I haven't been able to understand valuations of, flamboyance in valuations, colorful valuations of the likes of, Uber, Didi, Chuxing, Zomato. I've not been able to understand these. And, all the best to them. They can continue with their robustness.
Yeah.
And as long as there are people who are willing to buy the dreams, sell the dreams. So therefore, that goes on in a different perspective. Now, the third question is very important. What does it do to employment? Employment, again, is, if we primarily break it down into three components, one is employment with larger corporations. I think there we are already seeing some level of shrinkage. And then we come to employment in the realm of startups. Look, startups, Roy, have never been known for employment. They've been known for creating an ecosystem where a couple of people come together, they put in an enormous amount of hard work, and they create something which becomes a Google, which becomes a Facebook later on. So I think it's very essential, and this should be indeed a national priority for all countries, regardless of their position on tariffs, to keep promoting, to keep encouraging an ecosystem that encourages startups. The third and the most important, which we shall not forget, is self-employment. What are things like the current economic warfare going to do? I think self-employment is the one that's going to take the maximum hit, because people who have a small business, they do, let's say, a few $1,000s a day, or let's say $100,000 a month, and they survive. They are the ones who are not burdening the employment market. If you take them off the table, which we've already seen happening with the aggregator and the platform economy, if that segment were to die, couple that with artificial intelligence, which will rapidly make human beings redundant, then, Roy, we are talking about something which is order of magnitude greater and far more destructive than the small tariff wars in comparison.
Amazing. Great. So, as the world, leans towards more profits, more greed, more peril, so may we have the wisdom to really trade not only in goods and services and egos and vanities and upmanship, but also in investing in the realities of the common man who's always faced the brunt, as always. Thank you so much, Raman. It was a fantastic session of your intriguing thoughts and the way that you're able to weave the narrative around different complicated, let's say, contextures and structures and the various viewpoints and the schools of thought that comes in. It's not easy to kind of navigate that through, and I think you were able to kind of weave it through extremely well. So thank you so much again. And so this will be a wrap for this particular session. There's so much more to discuss, so probably there will be a sequel to it, But for now, this is your host, Roy, signing off, and I hope you enjoyed the insights as much as I did. And so until next time comes in, this is your Roy, host, signing off and saying goodbye. Do take good care of your health and keep shining. God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.